Have you ever walked the grounds of a crumbling medieval castle, gazed up at its towering stone walls, and noticed a strange, narrow structure jutting out over the edge, a tiny room that seemed to hang in the sky? What if I told you that was the bathroom? Yes, the toilet. Not tucked away in some hidden chamber. Not buried underground. No, it was built right into the wall, suspended over open air, often with nothing but gravity between you and a pit, a moat, or 100-foot drop. But why? Why would the proud architects of the Middle Ages, who designed thick walls to keep invaders out, who built towers to pierce the sky and dungeons to swallow secrets, place one of the most vulnerable, private parts of human life dangling off the side of a fortress? And how did these toilets on the wall, called garderobes, become not just a matter of sanitation, but of survival, warfare, and sometimes even treason? This story isn't just about where people went to relieve themselves. It's about how a civilization managed its filth, its fears, and its fragile hold on dignity. Because behind those cold stones and narrow openings lies a world where waste became weapon, where privacy was a luxury, and where the simple act of relieving yourself became a design challenge in the fight between man and nature, castle and siege, comfort and decay. Imagine a lord in robes trimmed with ermine, sitting in silence, high above the earth, on a plank of wood with a hole in the middle, the wind howling beneath, birds circling, and the faint echo of the moat below. He's not just doing his business. He's participating in one of the most oddly strategic parts of medieval life. And yes, people did fall through. Yes, invaders once climbed in through garderobes. Yes, some garderobes were used to store clothing because people believed that the ammonia rising from human waste would kill lice and moths. The deeper you go, the stranger it gets. So why did medieval people build their toilets on the outer walls of castles? It wasn't just convenience. It wasn't just a lack of plumbing. It was a calculated decision, part architecture, part superstition, part necessity. And tonight, we'll descend into that peculiar world, one stone ledge at a time. Part 1. The garderobe, a toilet hanging on the edge of the world. In the grand architecture of a medieval castle, where stone vaults met soaring arches, and defense-dictated design, there was one room that defied all expectations. It wasn't the chapel, nor the great hall. It wasn't the armory or the dungeon. It was the garderobe, a simple room, sometimes no more than a wooden bench with a hole in it, sometimes barely larger than a closet. And yet, it was carved into the very bones of the fortress, perched like a birdhouse on the sheer outer wall, sometimes dozens of feet above the ground. Why? Because gravity was the greatest plumbing system medieval people had. The garderobe wasn't built inside the castle walls, where waste would fester and stink. It was placed on the edge, literally, so that whatever was left behind could fall directly into a pit below, or into a moat, or into a drainage ditch that ran far from the living quarters. In essence, the toilet became part of the castle's defense system, by sending human waste down the side of the wall, far from the inner courtyards. It minimized the risk of disease and contamination, in a time when no one understood germs, but everyone feared the smell of bad air. It was crude, it was cold, but it worked. There was no flushing, no privacy, often no door, just a hole, a ledge, and the endless open air beneath. Some garderobes were designed as stone chutes, vertical shafts that dropped straight down into cesspits. Others were built like stone balconies, protruding from the wall, with wooden seats placed over narrow openings. The more sophisticated castles had double garderobes, twin stalls, side by side, for communal use. Yes, medieval people sometimes used the toilet together. And sometimes, in winter, the contents of those pits would freeze solid. There are stories of guards refusing to use certain garderobes because the wind would slice through the opening like a knife. Some even carried cloaks to drape over their laps as they sat, teeth chattering on the edge of oblivion. But that wasn't all. The word garderobe comes from the French for to guard ropes. In fact, in many castles, People stored their clothes in or near the garderobe, believing that the strong ammonia rising from the waste would kill lice and insects. So yes, imagine hanging your best tunic in the toilet stall and feeling relieved that it wouldn't get eaten by moths. The smell was overwhelming. But in an age before modern sanitation, this was as good as it got. Even more fascinating? Some garderobes were built with defensive intent. They became weak points in the castle's wall, easy access points for attackers. There are accounts of soldiers sneaking into castles by climbing up through the waste chutes, like grotesque invaders crawling through a wound in the fortress. Can you picture it? A knight, armored and soaked, clambering up a slick shaft in the dead of night, through filth, through stench, emerging in the garderobe, sword in hand. The irony? What was designed to take waste out became the door that let danger in. Life around the garderobe was anything but glamorous. Imagine being a servant in a castle, assigned the unpleasant task of maintaining the cesspits beneath the walls. It was backbreaking, revolting work. These men, often called gong farmers in later periods, had to descend into the pits to shovel out the solid waste by hand. No gloves, no protection, just a shovel, a bucket, and the sharp stench of ammonia that burned the nostrils and stuck to your skin for days. Even nobles weren't spared the humiliation, though they had their own private garderobes. Built close to their chambers, comfort was a relative term. There were no cushions, no toilet paper. Moss, straw, or scraps of cloth were the medieval alternatives, and they were often shared among users. There were times, during sieges, especially when the garderobe became a risk. Enemies would learn where they were located. They could flood them with fire or even try to smoke people out by sending flaming bundles up the chute. Defending the garderobe, ironically, became a matter of military urgency. And yet, despite all this, there was a kind of ingenuity to its design. The garderobe was usually built on the castle's outer curtain wall, positioned over steep slopes or deep moats so that waste would wash away with rain or tides. In some castles, chutes were angled just right to send waste into natural ravines or streams below. Gravity, weather, and geography worked together in a kind of primitive but effective sanitation system. But what happened when the wind turned? On stormy nights, strong gales would blow up through the garderobe openings, carrying not just cold air, but the scent of everything that had passed through. Servants would rush to cover the holes with wooden lids or slabs of cloth. Some garderobes were lined with straw or herbs to absorb moisture and mask the smell. Lavender, mint, even crushed juniper, not for luxury, but for survival. For women, using the garderobe added another layer of difficulty. Their long gowns made the process cumbersome and messy. Privacy was almost non-existent, even for noblewomen. In some castles, their garderobes were built slightly larger and given curtains, but that was the exception, not the rule. And then there were accidents. There are records, scattered and horrifying, of people falling through the seat and dying. A careless step, a rotted wooden plank, a gust of wind at the wrong moment. 1 second, they were perched above the world, the next, gone. Some say the ghosts of the garderobe still linger in ancient castles, whispering in drafty corners, forever embarrassed by the manner of their end. Still, the garderobe represented something critical in the medieval world, a boundary between human life and human waste. It was the best attempt they had to create separation, to build dignity where none naturally existed. Because even in castles of stone, where lords ruled and banners flew high, everyone, rich or poor, had to answer nature's call. And when they did, it was on a ledge in the wind, with no safety net but faith in stonework. Part 2. Sanitation, smell, and the fear of bad air in the Middle Ages. Before people understood germs, before microscopes revealed bacteria, and long before public health was a science, the medieval mind lived in fear of something they couldn't quite see, but could definitely smell. They called it miasma, bad air, rotten wind, the invisible breath of disease. To medieval people, stench wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. It meant the air was corrupted, poisoned, sick. It meant that illness was already nearby, creeping through alleys, slipping through castle windows, clinging to your clothes like a shadow. And nowhere did this fear show more clearly than in the way castles handled human waste. While we might view the garderobe as a primitive toilet built into a castle wall, to people in the 13th or 14th century, it was a barrier against sickness. By pushing their waste as far from their living quarters as possible, literally over the edge of the building, they believed they were protecting themselves from the deadliest kind of air. The one that smelled like decay. The logic was simple. If you could smell it, it could kill you. Of course, they didn't know about bacteria or viruses. But they did observe that where filth piled up, people got sick. They noticed that bad air often came before outbreaks. So they built their world around avoiding it. And in castles, that meant letting waste fall away from walls, down steep shafts, or into flowing water. Some castles even had ventilation towers connected to garderobes. These thin shafts of stone allowed air to rise up and out, keeping the stink and the supposed sickness from seeping back inside. It was their version of airflow, their attempt at purification. Smells weren't just physical, they were spiritual. A foul odor could be a sign of moral failure, a sign that your home, or your soul, was unclean. Monks wrote about this stench of sin. Saints were said to give off sweet smells. People burned incense not only in churches, but in homes, sick rooms, and even garderobes, trying to mask what they feared could kill them. And because of this, scent became an obsession. Medicinal herbs were hung in doorways. Lavender, thyme, sage, not for beauty, but for protection. People carried pomanders, small balls filled with spices or flowers, to hold near their noses in public. Physicians wore masks stuffed with dried petals, believing it would keep plague away. Even in castles, servants would stuff bundles of aromatic plants into garderobes or scatter dried flowers across the floor near them. Anything to fight the air, anything to keep death at bay. But still, sickness came. Despite their best efforts, disease swept through medieval cities and castles with relentless cruelty. Plague, typhoid, dysentery. The garderobe may have helped keep waste out of living spaces, but it couldn't stop contaminated water or flea-ridden rats. Still, the belief in bad air endured. It shaped cities, homes, and even toilets. And centuries later, even as science evolved, echoes of this fear remained. People continued to design around ventilation, from the outhouses of colonial America to the early plumbing systems of Victorian England. Because deep down, that instinct stayed with us. If it smells rotten, something's wrong. And so, in a strange and smelly way, the medieval fear of bad air helped push humanity toward cleaner living, even if it was built on misunderstanding. Their garderobes hanging over castle walls were crude, yes, but also an early stand against a world full of disease, darkness, and the unknown. In the silence of the night, deep within the stone belly of a castle, there was always a lingering presence, not a ghost, but a scent, a memory in the air. Not all castles were filled with banquets and battles, sometimes. They were simply filled with the smell of people trying to stay alive. Imagine this. A servant girl climbs narrow steps with a torch in hand, the flickering light revealing old stains on cold stone. She's headed to clean the Lord's garderobe, or, more likely, to scatter mint leaves and dried marjoram to mask the stench. No one likes this task, but everyone knows why it matters. Because in this world, foul smells meant more than discomfort. They meant danger. And in places where hundreds might live within the same stone walls, lords, knights, squires, maids, cooks, and messengers, disease could spread like wildfire. So castles, massive and slow as they seemed, were designed with these fears in mind. Garderobes weren't hidden in basements. They were suspended on outer walls, far from kitchens and feasting halls, hanging like tiny stone outposts of biological necessity. and when possible, they were positioned above moats or streams, so that the waste could be carried away by flowing water, a primitive kind of flushing, led by gravity and luck. In some larger castles, there were entire garderobe towers, vertical stacks of latrines with cleverly angled chutes. The waste from upper floors dropped into stone channels, which in theory pushed it away from the base of the wall. But in practice, let's just say the smell was persistent. No matter how advanced the design, no matter how high the wall, the fear of corrupted air lingered. And that fear wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Many believed that illness entered through the nose and made its way into the soul. The Latin phrase, in odoribus mors, in odors, death, was passed from monk to monk, whispered in infirmaries, and written in the margins of ancient medical texts. To them, healing meant more than treatment, it meant purification, which is why incense and smoke weren't just for churches. In some castles, garderobes were periodically cleansed with burning rosemary or juniper. The thick smoke was thought to kill the airborne evil. In fact, some lords had their garderobes ritually purified before winter, when windows stayed closed and air grew still, making the threat of miasma feel more menacing. It wasn't just superstition. It was survival, wrapped in ritual. And as strange as it sounds today, their instincts weren't entirely wrong. Waste piled too close did bring disease. Water sources were easily poisoned. And when a household failed to manage its smell, it often failed to survive the season. So they listened to their noses. They built outward. They kept their waste suspended. They let gravity carry away what no one wanted to face. And even if they didn't know why it worked, it often did. In that way, the garderobe became more than a toilet. It was an early step in public health. Crude, smelly, and clinging to the edge of a wall, yes, but a step forward nonetheless. Because sometimes, fear is a powerful teacher. And in the medieval world, the scent of danger was very real. Part 3. Engineering the garderobe, stone, strategy, and waste. You might think of a castle as a fortress for battle, a seat of power, or a romantic ruin. But in reality, castles were living machines, and like all machines, they had to deal with a constant flow of human activity, including the least glamorous part of it, waste. So how do you design a toilet in a time before plumbing, before running water, before even the concept of indoor sanitation? You build it into the wall, and you let gravity do the work. That's exactly what medieval builders did when they created the garderobe, a stone shaft that projected outward from the castle walls, with a hole carved into a wooden bench and a straight drop below. It might sound crude, but it was intentional design. These vertical shafts were built to expel waste far from the living quarters, often depositing it into a pit, a moat, or even a natural river below. If the castle sat on a rocky hill, engineers took advantage of the slope. Some garderobes were placed dozens of feet up, their waste dropping silently into ravines. In a few advanced designs, there were angled chutes, lined with stone or brick, that guided the waste down into a corner channel, like a medieval slide. With an unpleasant destination, the goal was always the same: keep filth moving away, keep smell and disease at bay. But engineering in the Middle Ages wasn't just about what you built, it was about where. Positioning was key. Most garderobes were placed on the outer walls, especially in the upper floors of keeps and towers. Why? Because it allowed for waste to fall freely into the open, and it kept the inner rooms free of stink. Some castles had multiple garderobes, each tailored to rank and status. The lord's garderobe might be in a private tower, accessible only from his chamber, while the garrison or servants might share a long bench over a communal chute, known as a latrine room. There was even a bit of strategy involved. During times of siege, garderobes could become a weak point, a possible way for enemies to tunnel in. Some castles addressed this by placing garderobes over sheer drops, making it nearly impossible for attackers to crawl up without being seen, or worse, splashed. Others reinforced the shafts with iron bars to block intrusion. But while most garderobes were built for function, a few were surprisingly elaborate. At Dover Castle in England, a 12th century structure features garderobes with ventilation slits, sloped stone seats, and even small hand-washing basins nearby, all carved right into the castle stone. In some noble homes, garderobes were lined with wood or padded with fabric for comfort and warmth. Even the waste collection was semi-engineered. Castle staff, often the lowest-ranking workers, were tasked with cleaning the waste pits below. Some castles had night soil men who removed waste under cover of darkness, shoveling it into carts and disposing of it far from the walls. It was dirty work. It was necessary work, and it kept the castle functioning. This wasn't luxury. It was survival by design. In the end, garderobes show us something remarkable, that even in an age of swords and superstition, people were thinking systematically about health, space, and engineering. They were using gravity as a tool, stone as a conduit, and architecture as a defense, not just against invaders, but against disease. Because when you live in a stone fortress filled with dozens or hundreds of people, what you do with the waste might just be the difference between life and death. The stone and brickwork that created the garderobe were more than just a clever design. They were an integral part of the castle's ecosystem. Like all systems of a fortress, the garderobe had a specific role to play in managing the flow of daily life, both for the well-being of the castle's inhabitants and the security of its structure. While grand feasts and royal banquets took center stage in the lavish halls, the less glamorous task of waste disposal often went unnoticed. The garderobe's architecture was not just a random choice. It was strategically planned with both function and hygiene in mind. These small chambers hanging from the walls often went unnoticed by those who lived and worked within the castle. But they had an important place in the lives of the castle's residents, even if they were hidden away in corners or positioned on upper floors. Their purpose was clear. They ensured that waste was carried away from the heart of the castle. When castles were initially built, the builders knew that waste had to be managed, even though the complex science of disease transmission was not yet understood. Still, medieval people understood that the proximity of waste to their living quarters was dangerous. The garderobes took advantage of this knowledge by placing waste out of sight, out of mind. Waste falling from upper floors of a castle was a simple, yet effective solution that relied heavily on gravity, a method of flushing waste far below to be dealt with either in a pit or a stream below the castle. The physical design of these garderobes was just as important as the strategic positioning. The garderobe itself often had a narrow stone seat with a circular hole, leading down into a stone shaft that would carry waste to the ground. As straightforward as it may seem, aligning the shaft properly with the ground below was essential, ensuring that the waste would be deposited as far from human activity as possible. In many castles, the waste would fall directly into moats, where it would be carried away by water. Other castles placed their garderobes above rivers, allowing the current to sweep the waste downstream, often away from the castle entirely. Not every castle had the same approach, though. The structure and design of garderobes varied based on the size of the castle, the available land, and the social rank of the residents. Some castles constructed complex garderobe towers, with several layers of latrines, one for the lord, one for the knights, one for the soldiers, and one for the servants. The wealthier you were, the better the facilities. Some wealthy lords even had their own private garderobes and towers, complete with their own wooden seats and access to cleaner waste removal. While castles with multiple garderobes catered to the specific needs of each rank, there were still many castles that shared their latrines between all the inhabitants. In larger castles, latrine rooms often had long benches with several holes, forcing people to share the space with others. It wasn't a place for privacy, it was simply a necessity. In larger castles, where the numbers of residents could range from 50 to several hundred, there was also the logistical challenge of waste management. Someone had to make sure that the pits were cleared regularly, and that the waste was removed, especially during times of siege. This job often fell to lower-ranking servants who worked in the night soil business, which was a stinky, unsavory job. During nighttime hours, these workers would take carts of waste away from the castle and dispose of it far from the walls, ensuring that the castle didn't become overwhelmed with the stench of human filth. Despite the engineering ingenuity of the garderobes, there was still the problem of odor. Even with the waste safely deposited far from the living quarters, the stench of the garderobe shafts could still permeate the air. Castles were often filled with a mix of smells, not all of them pleasant. To combat the odor, medieval inhabitants would burn incense, herbs, and spices to try to mask the smells of human waste and cooking. They would also hang lavender and rosemary around the castle to try and keep the air fresh. While some might imagine a castle to be a pristine, well-kept fortress, the reality was much more about compromise and practicality. The reality of medieval life meant that both wealth and cleanliness were often relative. A lord may have had a beautifully decorated chamber, but the garderobe shaft beneath his feet was a reminder of the harsh realities of castle life. A moat could keep out invaders, but it couldn't filter out the stench of night soil. Still, people carried on, living in their fortress homes, as the gravity-fed toilets became a crucial part of everyday survival. Garderobes were not simply a historical curiosity, they played a vital role in the health and well-being of the people inside the castles. Without proper sanitation, medieval people knew their homes would become havens for disease. A system like this, crude though it was better than having no system at all. It may not have been the clean, fresh air of modern sanitation, but it kept the majority of the waste out of sight and, more importantly, out of the living quarters. Part 4. Life around the garderobe. Smells, servants, and social norms. In the medieval world, the concept of privacy as we know it today simply didn't exist. While today we might enjoy the luxury of private bathrooms and modern plumbing, the inhabitants of castles had to navigate a more communal, often less than pleasant way of handling their daily bodily functions. The garderobe, sitting on the castle walls, was a fundamental part of that process, but the realities of its use went far beyond just a functional design. In medieval castles, the garderobe wasn't just a place for relieving oneself. It was also a symbol of the complex social hierarchy that permeated everyday life. The people who used it, the way they used it, and even where they used it all reflected the rigid social norms that defined medieval society. The hierarchy of waste disposal. In a medieval castle, social class played a pivotal role in determining who used the garderobe and where. The wealthier residents of the castle, such as the lord and his family, had more privileged access to cleaner and more private toilets, while the lower-ranking staff and soldiers had to make do with more communal facilities. The garderobes for the elite were often positioned in private chambers or located on higher floors, far removed from the public areas of the castle. These garderobes were often separate rooms or even entire towers, providing not only privacy but also a certain level of comfort. Some had wooden seats placed over stone chutes, which were more civilized than the open pits used by commoners. For the rest of the castle's inhabitants, including the guards, servants, and laborers, the situation was less luxurious. Their garderobes were usually much more public, often large rooms with long benches, where multiple people could use the facility at the same time. Privacy was practically non-existent, and the space was often shared with many others. At best, the communal latrines had crude wooden seats placed over a stone pit, where waste would drop down into a shaft. These rooms were often shared by multiple people, and unlike the private garderobes of the nobles, they were not designed with comfort in mind. This lack of privacy created a unique social dynamic, where bodily functions were carried out in the presence of others, reflecting the medieval worldview that everything was public, even the most intimate aspects of life. The role of servants. Within the social system, the servants were the ones who had the least control over their access to the garderobe. They had to follow the rules set by the lords and ladies of the castle, and their toilets were often located in inconvenient, uncomfortable places. Servants who worked directly for the family would likely have to share the same garderobe as other servants, and it was their job to ensure the garderobe was kept clean. It wasn't uncommon for servants to empty the waste pits, especially those in charge of night soil removal. This work was difficult, dirty, and often dangerous, requiring the servant to work under cover of darkness, removing the accumulated waste from the castle's walls. The task of cleaning and maintaining the garderobes was not only unpleasant but could also pose a health risk. Medieval people didn't fully understand how diseases spread, so poor sanitation was often a direct cause of epidemics in the castle. In fact, plague and illness were frequent occurrences during the Middle Ages, and the close quarters and unsanitary conditions in castles contributed to the spread of diseases. Despite this, the lower-ranking staff and servants had little recourse to demand better conditions for their daily toil. The garderobe as a space for the elite and the common folk reflected a stark divide in both living conditions and social status. The aristocracy had their own private spaces for bodily functions, while those serving them were relegated to shared, more exposed spaces. This disparity in treatment could be seen as a reflection of the larger social system of the time, where rank and status determined not only your quality of life, but also the most basic elements of your daily routine. The daily challenges. Using the garderobe, especially in a castle with multiple rooms or levels, came with its own set of challenges. First and foremost was the stench. With no ventilation systems, and the waste accumulating in pits below, the smell of the garderobe could become unbearable, especially in warmer months. To combat this, inhabitants would burn incense or place herbs around the rooms to mask the odor. Lavender, rosemary, and sage were commonly used, their scents meant to overpower the more unsavory smells of human waste. Additionally, the experience of using the garderobe was often uncomfortable. The stone seats, designed to channel waste down the shaft, were hard and cold, making the experience less than pleasant. And because the castle walls were made of stone, the garderobes were often drafty and cold, with no warmth or heating to help offset the discomfort. The mystery and superstition around waste. In medieval times, waste wasn't just a byproduct of human nature. It was often viewed with a sense of mystery and superstition. Human waste was associated with both dirt and danger, and was believed to carry with it evil spirits or malignant forces. Many believed that bodily functions were inherently connected to a person's spiritual health, and the act of expelling waste was often linked to rituals meant to protect the soul. Some castles even had rituals or superstitions associated with using the garderobe. For example, it was believed that if a person had bad luck or a curse placed on them, it could manifest in their waste. Others believed that evil spirits could travel up through the garderobe shaft, bringing illness or misfortune into the castle. To counter this, medieval people would sometimes invoke blessings or even holy water when using the toilet. Some castles also had special priests or monks who would bless the garderobes to ensure that no spiritual harm would come from these essential yet unpleasant spaces. The garderobe in the wider social fabric. While the physical act of using the garderobe was one of necessity, it also held a symbolic meaning in medieval society. It highlighted the division between the elite and the lower classes, emphasized the public nature of even the most private moments, and reinforced the idea that no one, regardless of status, was free from the basic needs of the body. In many ways, the garderobe was a microcosm of medieval society. It reflected both the practicalities and privileges of the time, the divide between the powerful and the powerless, and the complex interaction between function, hierarchy, and ritual. It was a reminder that even in a grand fortress built to withstand sieges and attacks, the basic elements of human existence could not be ignored. As we explore further into the role of the garderobe, It becomes clear that the simple act of using the toilet was intertwined with a series of cultural practices and social norms that defined medieval society. These toilets, often built into the walls of castles, served as much more than just functional spaces for waste disposal. They became symbolic representations of medieval beliefs, rituals, and the ways in which the people of the time understood their bodies, their relationships with the divine, and the natural world. The garderobe as a reflection of social hierarchy. The construction and use of the garderobe were largely dictated by social class, in a time where class distinctions were rigid and widely accepted. Nobles and peasants had vastly different experiences in almost every aspect of life, and the toilets were no exception. High-ranking individuals, such as the lord of the castle, often enjoyed relative comfort when using the garderobe. Their toilets were usually private, located in personal chambers or even isolated towers, offering a bit of seclusion. In contrast, the lower classes, including servants and soldiers, were relegated to public toilets that lacked privacy and were often overcrowded and unsanitary. These common spaces were the epitome of medieval communal living, where modesty and personal space were luxuries that the poor could not afford. The role of servants in maintaining the garderobe. Despite their humble status, servants played a critical role in maintaining the cleanliness of the garderobes. These servants were tasked with ensuring the garderobe shafts were clear, cleaning out the pits when they became too full, and emptying the night soil, a term for human waste. This responsibility was dirty and demanding, yet necessary, as waste management in medieval times was a vital but unpleasant aspect of castle life. Servants did this work in the dark of night, hauling the contents of waste pits to nearby fields, where it was often used as fertilizer. In some cases, these servants would risk their health by being exposed to unsanitary conditions that could spread diseases like the plague. Unfortunately, the lack of proper sanitation and understanding of disease transmission during the medieval period meant that hygiene, despite its importance, was not always prioritized in the construction or upkeep of these facilities. A place for rituals and beliefs. The garderobe, though a functional part of the medieval castle, was not free from superstition and ritual. In a world heavily influenced by religion and spiritual beliefs, bodily functions were seen as something ritually impure. Many medieval people believed that the excretion of waste was tied to sin and spiritual corruption. To cleanse oneself of the perceived spiritual impurity associated with using the garderobe, individuals would often perform small rituals before, during, or after using the facilities. For example, it was common for people to say prayers or invoke blessings before or after using the toilet. Holy water or sacred oils might be used as a cleansing ritual, purifying the person from the perceived filth of the body. These small rituals helped people reinforce their faith in a world where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were often blurred. Additionally, many medieval people associated excrement with evil forces, which led to the belief that devils or evil spirits could reside in waste and could be attracted to areas where human waste was stored. To ward off these spiritual dangers, people would take precautions by blessing their garderobes with holy symbols or prayers, ensuring that the space did not become a source of spiritual contamination. The symbolic and practical functions of the garderobe. On a more practical level, the garderobe also served as a means of waste disposal in an age where the concept of modern sanitation had not yet been developed. The waste disposal system in castles was relatively simple, but it worked effectively for the time. Waste would drop down a chute built into the castle wall, often leading to a cesspit or a pit latrine located beneath the building. The structure of the garderobe ensured that waste was disposed of outside of the living areas, reducing the potential for disease to spread. However, the garderobe did not eliminate all health risks. The poor ventilation and damp conditions that often existed in the castle's walls could create a breeding ground for harmful bacteria and diseases. The frequent overcrowding in communal garderobes also contributed to the spread of illnesses. Medieval castles, while impressive in many ways, lacked the plumbing systems and hygiene standards that we now take for granted. Interestingly, the presence of waste within the castle's walls also had economic implications. Waste was a valuable resource for agriculture and could be used as fertilizer for crops grown in nearby fields. As a result, the garderobe's waste was often collected and carefully transported to agricultural lands to improve the soil and increase crop yields. This connection between waste and farming was seen as a practical and beneficial side effect of what would otherwise have been a rather disgusting feature of the castle. The castle garderobe and medieval health. Despite its importance in waste management, the garderobe was not without its dangers. The constant exposure to human waste and the unsanitary conditions in some castles contributed to the spread of diseases. In particular, intestinal illnesses, dysentery, and even the plague were often spread through contaminated water or poor hygiene. The design of the garderobe, which allowed waste to drop directly into the earth beneath the castle, often led to poor drainage and contaminated groundwater. Medieval physicians, who lacked our modern understanding of germs and disease transmission, often believed that illnesses were a result of humoral imbalances in the body. While they did not recognize the role of waste in spreading disease, they did recognize that poor sanitation and filthy conditions contributed to health problems. Some medieval health practices even involved the use of herbal remedies and cleansing rituals to combat the effects of poor hygiene and contaminated waste. A complex relationship with hygiene. The relationship between hygiene and health in the medieval period was incredibly complex. While the people of the time had limited understanding of disease and infection, they understood that maintaining some level of cleanliness was crucial for survival. The garderobe, though unsanitary by today's standards, was part of a larger system of waste disposal that kept medieval castle life functional in an era without modern plumbing. In many ways, the garderobe represented the intersection of social class, health, and ritual in medieval society. It was a space where the basic human need to relieve oneself was met with a mix of practicality, superstition, and class-based segregation. While the garderobe may seem primitive and unsophisticated from a modern perspective, it served as a reflection of the times, a time when people had to rely on their resourcefulness and spiritual beliefs to navigate the often difficult realities of life in the Middle Ages. Part 5. The Fall of the Garderobe and the Dawn of Modern Sanitation. For centuries, the garderobe clung to the stone vanes of castles like a strange architectural afterthought, a humble tunnel through which the daily rituals of waste passed quietly, sometimes dangerously, into the world beyond. But nothing stays the same forever. The world was changing, and so too were the ways humans dealt with one of their oldest problems. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, cities were growing, trade was flourishing, and new ideas about health and cleanliness were stirring. Science, still in its infancy, was beginning to challenge centuries of belief rooted in superstition and humors. While the garderobe still held its place in many stone keeps, its reign was beginning to crumble, literally and figuratively, shifting from vertical to horizontal. As cities expanded and architecture evolved beyond fortified castles, the very idea of building a toilet that dumped waste down a vertical shaft hanging off the side of a wall started to feel impractical. Urban homes didn't have the luxury of high stone towers or isolated cliff edges. Instead, chamber pots, those humble little bowls, became the common person's solution. They were easy to carry, easy to empty, if not always responsibly, and didn't require a stone mason to maintain. In the countryside, the shift toward privies, simple outhouses over pits, was gaining ground. They were easier to build and maintain than stone garderobes, and more flexible in where they could be placed. People no longer needed to hang their waste over a moat or the side of a fortress wall. They just needed a shovel and a bit of land. The awakening of public health. Perhaps one of the biggest shifts in the fall of the garderobe came from the rise of public health awareness. By the 17th and 18th centuries, cities had become crowded, foul-smelling, and disease-ridden. And while people still didn't understand germs, they did start noticing a disturbing connection. Where there was filth, there was illness. Cholera outbreaks in the 1800s, especially in rapidly expanding cities like London, forced society to confront the dark truth. It wasn't just the smell that was the problem. It was the waste itself. This was when the real shift began. Visionaries like Sir Edwin Chadwick and Dr. Jon Snow, no, not the one from Game of Thrones, began mapping outbreaks, tracing infections, and fighting for modern sewer systems. They campaigned for cleaner streets, underground drains, and, eventually, flushing toilets that removed waste from human sight and scent entirely. The Great Flush Revolution. Enter the toilet revolution. By the mid to late 19th century, the invention of the S-curve trap by Alexander Cummings and the refinement of the flush toilet by Thomas Crapper, yes, that was his real name, signaled the final nail in the garderobe's coffin. The flush toilet was elegant, clean, and, most importantly, efficient. It didn't just push waste away from your home. It sealed it behind curves of water and sent it into hidden pipes leading to distant treatment centers. Toilets were no longer an extension of your outer wall. They were hidden, tucked discreetly into homes, bathrooms, and even public spaces. They weren't just practical. They were modern. By the early 20th century, the garderobe had all but vanished from daily life. Many of the old ones were sealed off, repurposed, or left to crumble in disuse. Where once noblemen had sat above a roaring wind or a dark pit, people now enjoyed the quiet click of porcelain lids, the soft swirl of water, and the clean, tiled privacy of bathrooms. Echoes in the stone. And yet, in the ruins of old castles across Europe, the ghost of the garderobe remains. Tourists now walk through narrow chambers and peer through openings in the walls, marveling at the audacity and simplicity of it all. They really went here? Someone always asks. Looking out at the drop below, a guide smiles knowingly. The medieval world was rough, raw, and often smelly. And this little stone chute, this primitive hanging toilet, was part of what made castle life possible. It's a reminder that even the mighty had to answer nature's call. That behind the pomp and armor and chivalry, there was always a need for somewhere to go. And for hundreds of years, that somewhere was built right into the bones of the castle itself. But not all garderobes disappeared into the pages of history without leaving a trace. Some evolved, quietly, unexpectedly, even as modern plumbing took root in cities and towns. Rural castles and manors that remained in use had to adapt. A few garderobes were retrofitted. Some were turned into ventilation shafts, others into storage alcoves. But in many forgotten fortresses across Europe, they remained frozen in time, still clinging to the outer walls like stony echoes of a messier, more precarious era. One thing that never changed, though, was the medieval mindset that waste belonged away from the living, far from beds, far from feasts, far from where people loved, worshipped, and fought. That guiding belief, however crude its execution, laid the foundation for the entire concept of separating sanitation from society. The garderobe, for all its quirks and dangers, was a stepping stone. Not just toward toilets, but toward the idea that human dignity includes the right to cleanliness, to privacy, and to systems that protect us from the very things our bodies produce. And maybe that's the strangest part of it all. Because somewhere beneath the turrets and tapestries, in the cold, drafty chambers of old castles, the humble garderobe helped shape the course of human sanitation, not by being glamorous, but by being necessary. So the next time you flush a toilet without a second thought, remember the wind howling through a stone shaft, the moat below, the torchlight flickering on moss-covered walls, and a solitary night, sitting on a wooden plank above the abyss, trusting the wall beneath him with everything he had. Part 6. Whispers from the Wall. Myths, Legends, and the strange life around the medieval toilet. The garderobe was never just a hole in the wall. It was a symbol, a space, and, oddly enough, a setting for many tales. Stories passed down through the generations, whispered by servants, shared in hushed tones by guards on night watch, and even written into the edges of old manuscripts. It turns out, when a place is as intimate and strange as a medieval toilet, it attracts more than just waste. It draws fear, superstition, and even a bit of humor. The dangers of going alone. For starters, using the garderobe wasn't always a private moment of peace. It could be downright terrifying. There were tales, some true, others exaggerated, of people falling through rotted wooden seats, knights who slipped during storms, nobles who leaned too far over the edge, children who wandered too close. And once you were in free fall down that cold stone shaft, there was no coming back. Some castles added iron bars below the chute. Others simply hoped for the best. But either way, no one took a trip to the garderobe lightly. In winter, the cold could bite through layers of wool. In summer, the stench could knock out a weak stomach. And always, there was the fear of what might be waiting in the dark. Creatures in the chute. Rats. Birds. Even snakes. Castle walls weren't airtight. And the garderobe chute was an open invitation to the creatures of the outside world. More than one medieval document makes note of people being startled, bitten, or swarmed while trying to relieve themselves. And let's not forget, this was a time before flashlights or disinfectant. Everything was shadow, flickering torchlight, and mystery. There's even an account, likely apocryphal, of a spy who attempted to enter a castle by climbing up the toilet chute during a siege. Some versions say he made it inside, only to be caught immediately and executed. Others claim he drowned halfway up, swallowed by centuries of filth. Either way, it became legend. And in the medieval world, legends were everything. Spiritual sanitation. But for all its earthly grime, the garderobe also became a strange kind of spiritual space. Some believe that evil spirits dwelled in unclean places. The toilet, therefore, wasn't just physically dirty, it was spiritually risky. A few texts advised saying prayers before entering. Charms were hung near the door, and in especially devout households. A crucifix might be carved into the wall, even above the seat, to ward off unseen forces. Superstition ran deep. If someone fell ill after using the garderobe, it was sometimes blamed not on disease, but on miasma, a dangerous vapor that was thought to rise from filth and carry curses or illness. It wouldn't be until much later, with the rise of germ theory, that people would understand what actually lived in those walls. But back then, all they had was fear and faith. The graffiti of the forgotten. And then there were the markings, scratched into stone, hidden behind ivy, buried beneath centuries of dust, graffiti. Servants would sometimes carve their names. Bored soldiers would draw faces, swords, or insults. Even nobles, seeking a strange kind of immortality, etched prayers or short poems while they sat in silence. Some of the oldest known medieval bathroom graffiti reads like a whisper from another world. God sees all. Even here, better to sit in peace than stand in war. He who eats garlic alone, sits alone. Humor, humility, and humanity, all trapped in stone. The echoes that remain. Today, few places in a castle feel as forgotten as the garderobe. Tourists pass by them quickly, wrinkling their noses, eager for grander chambers and golden tapestries. But if you linger, if you press your palm to the cold wall, and listen, you might hear echoes of another time. The rustle of a linen tunic. The clink of a sword laid gently aside. A breath held against the wind. A prayer whispered into the dark. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. But it was real. And that, in the end, is what makes the medieval toilet not just a curiosity, but a story worth remembering. But beyond the whispers, the drafts, and the stone walls, the garderobe tells us something raw and unfiltered about the truth of medieval life, a truth often hidden beneath armor and glory. behind stained glass and gilded pages. Because for all the grandeur of castles, their keepers still had to answer the same call of nature as everyone else. No amount of royal blood could change that, and there's something oddly humanizing about it. Knowing that a king once sat shivering above a dark shaft, hoping the wind didn't blow back up at him. That a noble woman once braved the bitter cold in the dead of night, guided only by a flickering candle, just to find a moment of relief. That servants had to scrub the stone floors below, not out of ceremony, but out of survival. It puts all the pageantry in perspective. When we picture the Middle Ages, we often imagine swords clashing, banners flying, choirs singing under vaulted ceilings. But we forget the mundane, the messy, the mortifying, the daily grit that connected everyone, no matter their station, to the same humbling reality, the final drop. And maybe that's the secret the garderobe holds. It reminds us that history isn't just about kings and battles. It's about people. People who laughed, who suffered, who needed to go, just like we do. People who built strange little rooms into towering walls because they needed somewhere to let go of what their bodies no longer needed to keep. And in doing so, they built the first steps toward what we now call modern sanitation. So yes, the garderobe was cold. Yes, it was dangerous. And yes, it smelled absolutely terrible. But it was a solution. A statement. A survival tool built into stone. And though most are silent now, filled in or sealed off, they still watch. They still wait. Because even when forgotten, the oldest parts of us remain. Even the parts we don't like to talk about. Part 7. What the Stones Remember. The legacy of the medieval toilet. Centuries have passed since the last noble sat above a wind-whipped shaft. Since the last servant emptied a waste pit beneath the castle wall. The garderobes are silent now, crumbled, sealed, reclaimed by ivy and shadow. But they are not forgotten. Because while the tapestries have faded and the thrones have been moved to museums, the garderobes, those crude, functional openings in the stone, are still there, still watching, still telling stories, reading the walls. For modern-day historians and archaeologists, garderobes are windows into the truth of medieval life. Not the official truth found in royal decrees or illuminated manuscripts, but the quiet truth, the one carved into stone, built into corners, and passed over by generations too proud to speak of it. These structures tell us about architecture, yes, but also about class, fear, survival, and the constant tug-of-war between human dignity and daily necessity. Some garderobes, when excavated, reveal layers of preserved waste, now hardened into archaeological treasure. With careful study, scientists can analyze seeds, parasites, even traces of medieval diets, what people ate, what they grew, what diseases they carried, and how their health fared over time. Others are discovered with scratched messages, faint carvings, or remnants of wooden beams long since rotted away. And in the more well-preserved castles, the garderobe stonework tells of intention, sloped channels, drainage plans, even small shelves or niches where candles might have once flickered. This was not chaos. It was careful design. What we've learned that medieval people were not as ignorant as we once thought. They didn't have microscopes. But they understood cause and effect. They knew filth bred illness. They knew to keep their drinking water separate from their waste. They invented gravity-powered sanitation systems hundreds of years before the flush toilet. We've learned that fear of bad air, miasma, led to real innovation. By pushing waste outward, away from bedrooms and banquet halls, medieval builders unintentionally protected lives, even if they misunderstood why it worked. We've learned that class shaped everything, even where you were allowed to go. And we've learned that, for all its discomfort and danger, the garderobe gave people something that should never be underestimated. Control. Control over their space. Control over their health. Control over one small, deeply human part of life. The echo we carry. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, we've learned how much of that old thinking still lingers. We still design our homes with bathrooms in quiet corners. We still separate the private from the public. We still burn candles and spray perfumes in tiny rooms with tile and porcelain. We still don't talk about it much. Even now, centuries later. We honor the same quiet contract. What goes in must come out. And we build our world around that simple, inescapable truth. The garderobe is gone, mostly, but its legacy lives in every pipe, every sewer, every system that keeps our cities clean and our homes civilized. Because the truth is, the history of toilets is the history of us. And in a strange, unexpected way, these old stone toilets, drafty, exposed, and unspeakably crude, remind us just how connected we are to the past. Because what we flush today, they drop down a chute. What we keep hidden behind locked doors, they placed in open towers. What we treat as shameful, they designed into the very heart of their fortresses. Not out of comfort, but out of necessity, out of survival, the silence that speaks volumes. When you walk the halls of a medieval castle, you hear echoes of the past and the clang of armor, the whisper of ghost stories, the crackle of torchlight. But if you listen carefully, you can hear something else, something more grounded. A kind of silent testimony from the walls themselves. These garderobes, long abandoned, are stories in stone. They speak not in words, but in design. Not in parchment, but in plumbing. They tell us, this is where we lived. This is how we endured. This is how we kept going. Even when the weather was brutal. Even when the world was cruel. Even when kings fell and dynasties crumbled, we still had to go. And so we carved holes in stone. We shaped gravity to our needs. We made space for the one act that unites us all. The act no one sings songs about, but everyone understands. Lessons left behind. The medieval toilet isn't just a curiosity. It's a mirror showing us how far we've come and how much we still share with those who came before. It teaches us humility. It teaches us ingenuity. It teaches us that even in the grandest of palaces, behind the thrones and tapestries, there is always a place no one talks about, but no one can live without. In that quiet, neglected corner, you'll find the truth. Not the kind written by victors, but the kind etched by human need. Because the people who built castles knew that before you could defend a kingdom, you had to build a place where the king could go, safely, quietly, and without falling off the wall. Part 8. From stone shafts to smart toilets, the evolution of going. From the stone garderobes hanging off medieval castle walls to the sleek, touchless restrooms of today. The story of sanitation has traveled a long, winding path, one that mirrors the rise of cities, the fall of empires, and the slow, stubborn progress of human understanding. The toilet, humble, hidden, often joked about, has quietly shaped civilization itself. When filth became science. After the Middle Ages, Europe began to change. The Black Death, which ravaged the population in the 14th century, had left a lingering fear of filth. For centuries, people believed that bad smells, miasmas, caused disease. And while the science wasn't quite right, the response created real change. New cities began to think more about drainage. Sewers were dug. Chamber pots were emptied more regularly. And slowly, the idea that waste needed to be moved away from people became law. By the 1600s and 1700s, inventors were tinkering. In England, Sir John Harington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I, designed one of the first flushing toilets. It didn't catch on right away, but it was a start. And then came the Industrial Revolution. The city problem. As London, Paris, and New York swelled with people, the waste problem became impossible to ignore. Tenements overflowed. Rivers turned black. Disease spread faster than doctors could treat it. The answer wasn't just medicine. It was infrastructure. In the mid-1800s, London built the Great Sewer System, engineered by Joseph Bazalgette. It was a masterpiece of hidden design, carrying filth far away from the city's heart. Cholera outbreaks declined. Life expectancy rose. And modern urban sanitation was born. Across the Atlantic, American cities followed suit. New York began piping water in from the Catskill Mountains. Underground sewer tunnels expanded. Indoor plumbing, once a luxury, became the new normal. Porcelain thrones and privacy. By the early 20th century, the bathroom was no longer just a practical space. It became a place of privacy, ritual, even comfort. Toilets were made of white porcelain, a material that looked clean. Bathrooms were tiled. Water tanks were hidden behind walls. Everything became smoother, quieter, more refined. And in a twist of history, the one room once suspended precariously over castle moats was now one of the most highly engineered spaces in any home. The digital flush. Today, we live in the age of smart toilets, heated seats, self-cleaning bowls, ambient lighting, even voice-activated lids. In Japan, high-tech toilets are part of daily life. In Europe and the US, bidets and water-saving flush systems are spreading fast. We've come a long way from stone chutes. And yet, the core idea remains the same: to protect our health, our dignity. In the spaces we call home, a final reflection. We don't often think about toilets. That's the point. When they work, they fade into the background. But they are among the most revolutionary inventions in human history. More than printing presses, more than automobiles, sanitation has saved billions of lives. And it all began with a simple, uncomfortable truth that the medieval world understood better than we give them credit for. You can build castles. You can fight wars. You can crown kings. But if you don't figure out what to do after dinner, your kingdom won't last long. But even now, with all our technology, we're still facing an age-old question. How do we deal with what we leave behind? In many parts of the world, sanitation is still a struggle. Nearly half the global population doesn't have access to safe, hygienic toilets. And while we design smart bathrooms and skyscrapers, children in rural villages are still walking long distances just for a private place to go. It's a reminder that progress is not evenly spread. For every smart toilet in Tokyo, there's a pit latrine in a forgotten town. For every city with a sprawling sewer system, there's a neighborhood where waste still runs through open drains. We've come so far, and yet, we're not done. The future of going. Engineers, environmentalists, and designers around the world are rethinking what a toilet can be. Some are working on composting systems that turn waste into fertilizer. Others are developing vacuum-powered toilets that use a fraction of the water. In water-scarce regions, researchers are testing dry toilets that operate without plumbing at all. And still others are asking deeper questions. What if your toilet could monitor your health? What if it could detect infections before symptoms appear? What if it became a daily check-in for your body, quietly gathering data while you go? Sounds futuristic? Maybe, but not long ago. The idea of flushing a toilet with clean water from a tank hidden behind your wall would have sounded like magic. The truth is, toilets have always been more than toilets. They are mirrors of society. They show what we value, what we ignore, what we fear, and what we're willing to innovate to avoid. Full circle. And so we come full circle, from cold stone seats jutting out of castle walls, to warm porcelain thrones in climate-controlled homes. From crude chutes to cloud-connected devices. From survival to sanctuary. It turns out, the history of the toilet isn't just about plumbing. It's about people. People who adapted. People who endured. People who dared to imagine something better, even for the most private, least glamorous part of life. And in doing so, they helped shape a cleaner, safer, more dignified world for all of us. Conclusion: the throne on the edge. When we think of castles, we imagine towers, moats, great halls, and echoing footsteps across stone floors. We picture kings and queens, knights and feasts, banners in the wind. But few imagine a toilet, dangling over the edge. And yet, that quiet, exposed little room hanging from the castle wall tells a story that is just as real, just as essential. Because behind every empire is a basic truth. If you don't deal with your waste, your walls will crumble from the inside. The medieval garderobe was more than just a hole in the wall. It was an innovation, a response to danger, disease, and the daily needs of human life. It showed a world trying to survive, not just with swords and stone, but with cleverness and compromise. Today, we sit on porcelain seats in climate-controlled rooms. We press buttons. We flush and walk away. We rarely think about it. But maybe we should, because the history of toilets isn't just about hygiene. It's about adaptation. It's about how humans have always looked for better, cleaner, safer ways to live, even in the least glamorous corners of our existence. The garderobe on the castle wall is long gone. But the lesson remains. Even kings must go, and even castles must be plumbed,